If you're looking for a detailed breakdown of Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by the Beatles, then you're in the right place. In this video, we're going to analyze the song's structure, instrumentation, chord progressions, time signatures, and lyrics to find out why it works so well. I'll also be commenting on how some of the more unusual features of this song mark it as a seminal work in the psychedelic music genre. And stick around till the end for today's Song Challenge, a segment where I challenge you to find songs with a specific musical feature covered in today's video. Alright, let's get into it. On a macro level, this song is quite simple structurally. There are three main sections: the verse,
picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies.
the pre-chorus,
Cellophane flowers of yellow and green towering over your head.
and the chorus.
Lucy in the sky with diamonds.
The basic pattern is verse, pre-chorus, chorus, which repeats. So far, very standard song structure. Now, the majority of songs would introduce variation at this point with a bridge, a section comprised of new material. Or alternatively, if there is a third verse, it usually has quite different instrumentation to the previous verses. But the Beatles just go back around here and begin a new verse with no change to the instrumentation. The song is seemingly going around in circles with little variation. So at this point, it almost begins to feel like we're stuck in a recurring loop, in a recurring loop, in a recurring loop, in a recurring loop, similar to the thought loops people can experience when using psychedelic substances. However, it turns out we're not trapped in a never-ending circular song, because we do snap out of this loop when instead of following the third verse with another pre-chorus, the song skips the pre-chorus and launches straight back into the chorus. This unexpected diversion from the established structural order grabs the listener's attention and also prevents the structure from becoming overly monotonous and predictable. The chorus is then repeated 3 times with the song fading out during the third repetition. Although this is very much John Lennon's song, it's hard to overstate the contributions of Harrison and McCartney when it comes to the creative sonic textures found in the instrumentation. Specifically, Harrison's use of Eastern instruments and playing techniques, and McCartney's organ part, which opens the song and continues throughout the verses. Let's begin with that organ intro. This beautiful arpeggiated riff is one of the most recognizable parts of the song, and it establishes the mood here brilliantly. It's built on a descending chromatic bass line, played over an A major chord. That chromatic line gives the music a sinking feeling, like we're drifting off into a dream. The chromaticism also adds a certain blurriness to the harmony, transforming that single A chord into a variety of permutations. We're not limited to the notes of the scale here, just like the psychedelic Alice in Wonderland inspired dream world depicted in the lyrics is not limited by the rules of waking reality. Also, this organ has such a unique sound that it could easily be mistaken for another of Harrison's Eastern instruments. It sounds almost like a harpsichord crossed with a music box, crossed with an organ, crossed with something from India. The point is, it's not something that we're used to hearing, like a piano. So in that sense, it perfectly captures the strangeness of this mind-bending fantasy land that Lennon is referring to in his lyrics. This organ riff continues into the verse, where it is joined by Lennon's lead vocal and McCartney's bass guitar, which emphasizes the descending chromatic line. As for Lennon's vocal, you'll notice that it's doubled on the last line of the verse. And they've also shifted the formant of his voice up ever so slightly, which gives his voice an altered sound, almost like he's sucked helium from a balloon.
Answer quite slowly, a girl with kaleidoscope eyes.
Meanwhile, Ringo Starr fills the spaces between Lennon's vocal lines with swung 16th notes, which add a cheeky playfulness to proceedings.
Marmalade sky.
Then, in the second half of the verse, Harrison makes his entrance on tambura, a drone instrument.
Somebody calls you, you answer quite slowly. A cow.
And the final bit of instrumentation comes courtesy of George Martin on piano, playing a single low D minor chord, which signals a switch into both a new key and a new structural section, the pre-chorus. The arrival of the pre-chorus is marked by a change in instrumentation. The tambura and organ are gone, and in their place we have guitars. The acoustic guitar simply strums eighth notes, assuming we're in 6/8 time. If we are analysing this song in 3/4 time, the guitar would be playing quarter notes. Now Harrison's electric guitar part here is quite interesting because he's attempting to mimic the sound of the sarangi, an instrument which typically shadows the vocal melody in Indian music. And if you listen, you'll hear that Harrison's guitar melody is indeed doubling Lennon's vocal part.
Cellophane flowers of yellow and green, towering over your head.
And the way he plays the melody is also quite unique. Instead of plucking each note of the melody, he plucks a single note and then bends the guitar string up and down to move between different notes. This captures the way the fretless bowed sarangi often glides between notes. The bass guitar also becomes more active in this section, playing eighth notes mostly on the first and fifth degrees of the chords. So 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, 5. Then he goes up through the triad of this next chord, 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5. Then back to 1, 5, 1, 5. And then up through the triad again, 1, 3, 5, 1. And then falling down through the notes of the scale to land on D. Dum bum bum bum. We also get a more consistent drum part in the pre-chorus, with eighth notes in the ride cymbals and some occasional swung 16th notes thrown in.
Cellophane flowers of hovering over your head.
At the end of the section, Starr gives us those three big tom hits, establishing the beat of the new time signature and counting us into the chorus.
And she's gone.
Like most songs, the chorus is the most instrumentally dense part of the song. We keep all the instruments from the pre-chorus, but also bring back the organ, backing vocals, and a full piano part, so everything except the tambura. George Martin's piano part is pretty quiet in the mix, so you don't really hear it. It's just there to add a bit more weight to the chorus.
Lucy in the sky with time. In the sky with time. Lucy in the
Apart from the first few words, Lennon's vocal is doubled throughout the chorus, and McCartney joins in for the third repetition of the titular line, singing thirds above Lennon's part.
Lucy in the sky with diamonds.
In subsequent choruses, McCartney's harmony is included from the start of the chorus. The bass guitar plays a run up through the G major scale, or D mixolydian mode, depending on how you hear it. So it begins on the low G and hits every note in the scale up to E before landing down on D. The electric guitar shadows this bass run.
Lucy in the
Meanwhile, an acoustic guitar with a flanger effect plays the chords. And finally, we have the organ coming in with the snare drum on beats 2 and 4. Another thing to note is that the instrumentation of each section is fairly consistent throughout the song, which reinforces that idea of a trance-like loop I mentioned when talking about song structure. However, if you listen carefully, you'll notice that there are some subtle variations in McCartney's bass part between repeated sections. This results in the bass part having a very free, almost improvised feeling. The part is not set in stone, it's organic, like it's alive and growing stronger and more confident as the song progresses. And this evolving nature is one of the things I really love about the bass in this song. I'll point out a few examples of how McCartney varies his bass lines in repeated sections. In the first two verses, the bass largely sticks to the two main beats of each 6/8 bar. But in verse 3, McCartney climbs up through the triad of one chord and throws in some extra eighth notes. It feels like the bass is becoming more exploratory and restless. In the first pre-chorus, the bass mainly sticks to the root and fifth of the chords it's playing over. However, in the second pre-chorus, the bass is much more active, playing through the whole triad of most chords it accompanies. And finally, you'll notice that McCartney ends each of the chorus sections slightly differently too. In the first chorus, he bounces between the D and the high A, while in the second chorus, he bounces between the D and the low A. Then in the last set of choruses, he arpeggiates the A major and D major chords, but he does it differently each time. So the first time, and the second time. Note how the second time he also throws in a chromatic passing note between the A and G right at the end. Now, he didn't need to include all these variations. He could have just played the same part across repeated sections and it still would have been a fantastic bass part. But that's one of the traits that makes McCartney one of the greats. He's not just aiming for something that's sufficient. He really goes the extra mile to squeeze every bit of creativity he can into a part, even if it's in service of someone else's song. This song has 3 sections, and these are the chords that make up those sections. I've put this A in brackets because it only occurs in the choruses at the end of the song. It's like a joining chord between repeat choruses. Now the verse is in the key of A major. As I mentioned previously, the chords in this section are created by playing a chromatic descending bass line under an A major chord. But only 2 of the resulting chords are from our A major key, chord 1 and chord 6. The other chords include a major flat 6 chord and a minor 4 chord, which have both been borrowed from the parallel minor key, A minor. And finally, we have this augmented F chord. Now, augmented chords are very colourful chords, but they also have quite a strong sound, sometimes jarringly so. Therefore, you don't see them that often in pop music, but this is late 60s Beatles, so anything goes. Here, it adds an eerie tension to the progression. It's also interesting to note that the F augmented chord is kind of stuck halfway between being an A major chord and an F major chord. If we move the C sharp down a semitone, the chord becomes F major. Alternatively, if we move the F down a semitone, the chord becomes A major. It's the latter resolution that occurs here, although the second time around, we bypass the augmented chord and go straight to F major. This tension between A major and F major is foreshadowing the coming key change, which occurs at the end of the verse when we slip into the F major key via this D minor pivot chord. A pivot chord is a common chord between two different keys that is used like a bridge to cross from one of those keys over to the other. So we can think of the D minor chord as both a chord of the key we are in, A major, as well as a chord of the key we are changing to, F major. Now technically, D minor is not a true pivot chord because it is not part of the A major key, but it is a borrowed chord that is often used in the A major key, so it still has a reasonably strong connection to the key. But we are certainly already moving away from A major through its use. Now, another thing that makes this transition quite seamless is the smooth voice leading from the preceding F sharp minor chord to the D minor chord. One note remains the same, while the other two notes only move one semitone. The final part of this transition is the appearance of the C in the bass, a note that is in F major but not in A major. This C note pulls us over to the new key as it steps down to the B flat major chord in the first bar of the pre-chorus. At this point, we are firmly in the new key. Now, most people, according to other analyses I've read on the internet, believe that the pre-chorus key is actually B flat major. This is likely because the pre-chorus section begins with a B flat major chord. It's our arrival point into the new key, so it admittedly sounds like our home chord when we first encounter it. But if this is the case, we have to explain these C chords as secondary dominants and secondary subdominants, which is fine. But for me, the more straightforward explanation for these C chords is that we are in the key of F major and they are simply part of our key. The pre-chorus being in F major also fits with the earlier foreshadowing of F major in the verse. But the main reason I think this section is in F major is quite simple. F feels like our tonal center. If I play this progression, finishing on F feels complete. It feels like home. But if I finish on B flat, it feels unresolved. That doesn't feel like home to me. That does. I think the main thing that makes the key of this section difficult to pin down is how transient it is. We've barely arrived in the key before we begin to shift out of it again. These three chords are the transitional point between the pre-chorus key and the chorus key, and they're cycling clockwise around the circle of fifths beginning on C. Interestingly, immediately prior to this, the chords cycled anti-clockwise around the circle of fifths beginning on C. So we have a bit of a mirror image thing going on here. So at this point, you could say that we have a succession of plagal cadences, or subdominants resolving to their tonics, which ultimately leads us into our new key, D major. So we have C as the subdominant of G, and then that same G as the subdominant of D. So at this point, when we come to rest on the D chord, which rings out for a full bar, we have arrived in our new key. The arrival of this new key also coincides with a new time signature. We are now in 4/4 time. Everything prior to this was in 6/8 time, or 3/4 time, depending on how you want to look at it. Okay, the chorus. Starting on chord 4, it climbs up through the major flat 7 chord to rest on chord 1 for a full bar. During the last chorus section, we also get this A major chord between repeated choruses, which slots nicely into the D major key as chord 5. For the first two choruses, the progression ends on the D major chord and then falls to the A major chord on the first bar of the verse. So we can think of the D as a pivot chord. It is both chord 1 of D major in the context of the chorus, but also chord 4 of A major in the context of the verse. So we get back to the verse via a plagal cadence, or chord 4 to chord 1. Now many people say the chorus is in the key of G major, and while it's not the conclusion that I've come to, I will admit that there is some strong evidence for this take. First, the first chord of the section is G major, so chord 1 if we are in the key of G major. And the three main chords fit perfectly into the key of G major, although the A major in the final choruses does not. Also, McCartney's backing vocal in the chorus finishes on a C. This gives us a D seventh chord, the dominant seventh of G major, so the 5-1 relationship here is very strong.
Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds.
However, as a casual listener, you don't even hear this C note. I only noticed it because I listened to the isolated vocal track. And we could just think of this D7th chord as chord 1 becoming a momentary secondary dominant of G major to bring us back to the start of the progression. Another way of looking at this, which is a kind of compromise between G major and D major, is to say that we are in the D mixolydian mode. So basically, in the key of G major, so all the notes of G major, but with D as our tonal center and our chord 1. That conveniently incorporates the major flat 7 chord into the mode, but there will still be modal mixture because we have to account for this A major chord, which we would say is borrowed from the parallel Ionian mode, more commonly known as D major. Now, whether D mixolydian or D major, there are a few key things that make me lean toward D being the tonal center rather than G. First, just before the chorus, when we first arrive in the key, and during the chorus at the end of the progression, we rest on the D major chord for a full bar, making it feel like our destination or home. In contrast, we only spend half a bar on the other chords, including G major. Another thing, we can easily swap out the major flat 7 chord for chord 5 of D major, and it sounds like the same key to me. So here's the chorus with the major flat 7 chord. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. And with an A major chord instead of a C major chord. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. And if this version of the song sounds strangely familiar, it's probably because we've pretty much transformed it into a song by The Doors. Come on baby, light my fire. Come on baby, light my fire. Another psychedelic song with a chorus that does not begin with chord 1. 4, 5, 1 is also the same progression that the pre-chorus begins with. At least to me, beginning these sections on a chord other than chord 1 is quite psychedelic because it blurs the boundaries between these sections. So instead of finishing one section and then beginning the new section on chord 1 of the new key, it feels more like we've just drifted into something already in progress. It's like changing the frequency dial on an old radio and suddenly finding yourself dropped into the middle of a new song. It takes a moment for you to get your bearings and find the center of the new key. Now, while I hear the tonal centers of these sections as A, F, and D, the standard conclusion that most people come to is A, B flat, and G. So think of that as the standard, and what I've offered here as an alternative take. But if you have any further insights into what's going on with the keys or tonal centers in this song, let me know in the comments. I want to briefly touch on the two different key signatures used in this song. The chorus is in 4/4 time, while the verse and pre-chorus can either be thought of as being in 6/8 time or 3/4 time. If we say it's in 6/8 time, that means there are 6/8 notes per bar. Now if we take the quarter notes of the chorus and divide them into 8th notes, you'll hear that the duration of 8th notes is consistent across the whole song. So, dun 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 dun, bum bum bum, Lucy in the sky. However, if we see this song as being in 3/4 time, that means we have 3 quarter notes per bar instead of 6/8 notes per bar. So when we switch to 4/4 time, the quarter notes suddenly last for twice as long. Bum 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 bum, do do do. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. So we have a shift to half time. In other words, time slows down. If we didn't have this shift to halftime, it would sound like this. Bum 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 bum. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Given that this song is a hallmark of psychedelic music, it would be remiss of me not to point out that this slowing down of time could be seen as a musical depiction of time dilation, another effect that users of psychedelic substances often experience. When one experiences time dilation, it typically feels like time is moving much slower than it actually is. For example, 5 minutes may feel like 1 hour to someone under the influence of a psychedelic substance. Finally, it's worth noting that the actual tempo of the song increases as the song progresses. To see what I mean, listen to the first chorus and then skip ahead to the last chorus. The later sections are faster. Now, there's been a lot of discussion over the years over whether or not Lennon wrote this song about a specific psychedelic substance that was very popular in the late 60s. In particular, there's been a large focus on whether he chose the obscure lexical words of the song's title as a way to encode the name of this substance as an acronym. While other songs have certainly done this intentionally, it turns out that in this case it was just a happy accident, and the song was actually based on the title of a drawing done by Lennon's young son. In addition, while his son's picture provided the initial spark that set the song in motion, Lennon said that the rest of the lyrics were based on the works of Lewis Carroll, specifically Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. These stories follow a girl who finds herself transported to a strange, cartoonish fantasy world where she's able to communicate with animals and flowers. She also eats special cakes and mushrooms, which shrink her down in size to the point where those flowers are towering above her. This is also a world where time has the ability to stand still. And at one point, Alice even finds herself in an enchanted forest where she has an identity crisis and completely forgets who she is. Pretty trippy stuff for a children's story written by a mathematics professor, and you can certainly see how some people might have got the idea that Lennon's lyrics were based on hallucinogens. So I accept that the acronym happened by accident and that the song was inspired by a young Julian Lennon's drawing and Lewis Carroll's surreal novels. But at the same time, I find it hard to swallow that the Beatles were all blissfully unaware that they were creating something that could potentially be aligned with the psychedelic subculture here. On some level, they had to know, right? I mean, let's look at some of these lyrics. The line "grows so incredibly high" is obviously referring to the height of the flowers, but it could also have a sneaky double meaning, especially when this is not the only line in the song that seems to depict people under the influence. We also have "head in the clouds and you're gone," and "everyone smiles as they drift past the flowers." Kaleidoscope eyes is another interesting phrase, because the patterns seen when peering into a kaleidoscope are supposedly quite similar to the complex, colourful, changing fractal patterns that people reportedly see when under the influence of strong psychedelic substances. But ultimately, it really doesn't matter what the Beatles' intentions were with this song when they wrote it. Once released, it was largely out of their control, and was inevitably moulded by the reactions of audiences and the obvious parallels to the psychedelic subculture of the time, and that version of it became part of the zeitgeist. So regardless of the band's intentions, the song will always be associated with psychedelic culture and that particular substance encoded in the song title. So having established that the song is most likely not about psychedelic substances, it is important to make a distinction between music where psychedelic substances are the topic of the lyrics and actual psychedelic music, or songs that fit into the psychedelic genre. What makes a song psychedelic is not the lyrical subject matter alone, but the way it uses a combination of musical elements in ways that reflect the psychedelic experience. In the psychedelic genre's attempt to portray the strange, mystical, and ineffable, the guardrails really start to disappear to the point where almost anything is possible. So it's a genre that really lends itself to experimentation and innovation. Some typical techniques include using multiple key signatures and time signatures to reflect a shifting into different states of consciousness and a blurring of one sense of self into a oneness with other people, places, and the universe at large. Effects like strong reverb, phasing, and flanging are also used to represent the blurring and shifting nature of the experience. Songs in this genre often feature long, improvised instrumental sections and can often stretch well beyond the typical 2 to 4 minute range that most popular songs occupy. Instruments that are not usually used in Western music, particularly Indian instruments, are often used to evoke the strangeness and sense of mystical or divine that people often feel when affected by these substances. This is likely because to the Western ear, these instruments sound foreign and a little strange. But it may also be because some of these instruments just have an objectively mystical feel to them. And finally, surreal lyrics, like those in Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, are a common feature of the genre. Now, having a couple of these features does not make a song psychedelic. Each of these features can be found in other musical genres. Similarly, a song does not need to have all of these features to be classed as psychedelic. There's no magic formula or cutoff point for deciding which songs fit in the genre and which don't, but these typical features give you an idea of what to look for. So, a song does not need to be about mind-bending substances to be psychedelic. Likewise, you can have a song about psychedelic substances that doesn't really fit into the psychedelic genre. For example, Day Tripper is a song about tripping and hippie culture, but it's nowhere near as psychedelic, stylistically, as Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. In summary, while Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is not about a psychedelic substance, it certainly has most of the common musical features associated with psychedelic music, and therefore fits very comfortably into the psychedelic genre. In fact, I would go as far as saying it is one of the key songs of the psychedelic genre from that 60s-70s period, and has had a huge influence on the psychedelic music that followed in subsequent generations. The other major achievement of the song is that unlike a lot of offerings from the genre, in spite of its weirdness, it still manages to be quite accessible to more mainstream audiences. It has a fairly conventional overall structure, a catchy chorus in 4/4 time, simple but memorable melodies, and is only 3.5 minutes long. Now, I encourage you to visit the Beatles' official YouTube channel and listen to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds again in light of everything we've covered in today's video. Here are the sections again, and the times they start to help you navigate the song more easily. And if you can think of anything I've missed, or even if you just have a different perspective on anything I've said, let me know in the comments. Okay, time for today's song challenge. Today's challenge is to think of songs that fit into the psychedelic music genre. Now, genre is just a construct, so there are no right or wrong answers here, and it's probably best to think of the genre in terms of a continuum, where we can think of songs as being less psychedelic or more psychedelic. And the exact point on this continuum, where a song ceases to belong in the psychedelic genre, is up to each individual listener. So we might put Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds somewhere around here, and if we were to consider Day Tripper as part of the genre, we'd definitely place it somewhere on the lighter side of the continuum. While by no means an exhaustive list, these are some of the features that typically appear in the genre, to give you an idea of what to look for. I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with, and like and subscribe if you got something out of this video.